Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video. This week we're looking at ethnicity, religion and age, which are external influences on consumer behaviour and part of the fourth module in our textbook for this subject. So, when you finish your learning for this week, you should understand consumer culture and how subcultural influences, in particular ethnicity, religion and age, guide our choices. They're the ones we're going to focus on today. There's three different cultural theories that can guide the analysis of consumer culture, and we'll briefly touch on those. You want to understand the difference between high and low context cultures, and also how the generation into which you're born can influence your lifestyle choices and our consumers' lifestyle choices and buying behaviours. We're going to touch on those briefly today, and then I expect you to go and do some additional reading to sort of get your head around what each of them are. So, defining culture. Culture can be thought of as a society's personality. It's developed through our knowledge, values, beliefs, our ethics, laws, and material objects and services. So it's quite a broad concept that has lots of different things feeding into it. Culture is an accumulation of shared meanings, rituals, norms, and traditions among members of an organisation or a society. It takes time for a culture to develop, and sometimes when we're part of a culture, it's hard to understand what makes a culture unique. Sometimes we need to look at different cultures to sort of get a sense of what's unique about our own. So a culture is created from a range of sources, including our language, nationality, education, and religion. This clip here is an oldie but a goodie. It's by HSBC Bank, and it talks about how business people dealing in different cultures have to be aware of the cultural norms, and they're sort of selling the product that they can support you with that, but it's quite fun to have a look at. The slides for this will be available for you in the in your Interact page, and also in your weekly lecture slides. So subcultures are little confluences of people with similar sort of characteristics within society at large. So a consumer culture is also affected by group membership within the society, and this is building off that discussion of self-concept that we started last week. So these are known as subcultures, and their members share beliefs and common experiences that set them apart from others. Now, each of us belong to many different subcultures. So there might be one related to the school that we're a member of. Again, it's sort of part of the groups. There might be sporting subcultures. There might be some based off your heritage. And there's others that are part of our kind of leisure pursuits or the things that we're interested in. So there's an example here of people from a Game of Thrones subculture. And this SBS article here provides some really interesting subcultures from Australia that you might like to have a look at, sort of get a sense of them. It's a bit of a light-hearted take, so but have a look if you choose. So essentially we talk about three different types of three culture theories that we could use to consider culture, how cultures differ in a community, or differ in a society rather. So there's Triandus from 1972, and he has he talks about cultural variation theory. Hofstede's theory of cultural differences, which came out in 1980, and then the globe theory. So there's some similarities and differences across each of these. Essentially, the first one suggests that cultures vary based on three characteristics. So our complexity or simplicity, that's two ends of a spectrum, our tightness or looseness, and our collectivism, our perspectives on collectivism or individualism. So using this theory, Australia would be considered complex because we've got lots of technology, lots going on in our culture, and I encourage you to read more about each of these in the text. We've got a kind of loose sort of a culture. So complex because we have a high use of technology, strong education system, high population density, and a developed economy. We're loose because there's tolerance of different norms among subgroups. There's geographic mobility, and there's a decentralised power in social systems. But we're also individualistic. We prioritise personal goals over group goals, and we emphasise independence and resist authority. So Hofstede's dimensions are the next ones. Now, these have been used quite a bit. There are some criticisms of these, but it's quite helpful sort of taxonomy. Again, they talk about the difference between a high and low power distance, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. The difference between collectivism. So power distance is when, say, for example, if a culture has low power distance, everyone's sort of seen on an equal footing. For example, parents treat children as equals, subordinates are consulted. When there's a high power distance, parents teach children obedience, and subordinates are just expected to do what they're told. And that plays out more in some cultures than others. Again, you can see the collectivism versus individualism, whether the culture focuses on the good of the collective or the good of the individual, a feminine or masculine sort of trait. So Australia tends to be a bit masculine. We have that view that we can conquer nature, but obviously we're a multicultural society, so there's a bit of a morphing happening there, I think. We also talk about uncertainty avoidance. Some cultures like uncertainty, others don't. And then a long-term or short-term orientation. We're interested in short-term goals or working towards the long term. So the globe is the third theory. So each of these I'm just skimming over, as I said, but I'd like you to just spend a bit of time thinking through each of these this week. Oh, sorry, before I move on, the criticisms of Hofstadter's theory is that it's getting a bit old. It may not be relevant now. There's also this assumption in the model that these are the only dimensions of culture, but it's possible that there are others that we could identify if we spent the time looking into culture. And also maybe because of this is 35 years old now, or it's more than that. It's getting more than that. So whether or not the dimensions in this are actually relevant today as they were when this happened, it's over 40 years old now, isn't it? So let's think about the globe next. So essentially globe's a more recent approach, and it talks about cultural clusters. So it groups countries that share similar cultures or cultural characteristics. But again, it's got a range of, let me move me out of the way, characteristics. So power distance is there again, collectivism also, uncertainty avoidance. So you can see how it's built on the previous models. But there's also performance orientation, humane orientation, assertiveness. It's a variety of characteristics. So in the next table, which is also available, which is in your text, this provides an example of the types of countries that sit together because of the similarity in their cultures. So you can see Australia sits with England, South Africa, New Zealand, Ireland, and the US and Canada. I think white South Africa. So you can see that, and I think looking at this for me, I can see why some of these countries have been grouped together in terms of their cultural clusters. Okay. Moving on, because we're going to run out of time. Ethnic subcultures are quite interesting. Ethnic identity is a really significant component of a person's self-concept, and for some it's more salient than others, more important to them than others, depending on maybe how far distant your ethnic heritage is, on how important it is to what you do every day or who you are and your family. An ethnic subculture is a self-perpetuating group of consumers who are held together by common cultural or genetic ties. Ethnicity is a way of describing people who have a similar language, common racial ancestry and religion. Australia is one of the most multicultural nations in the world. And in that reason, we're very lucky that we have, the opportunity to get to learn about lots of different cultures and lots of different ethnicities. Now, in the text, they talk about a statistic where they say 44.3% of the Australian population were born overseas, which is identified in the 2016 census, which is just an incredible number, I think. I went back and had a look at this to see if this had changed, because we've just done a recent census, but that information's not out yet. But from their end of financial year data in 2020, they suggested that 29.8% of the Australian population were born overseas. So there's a bit of a disparity between those two numbers, and I couldn't quite quickly identify why, but either way, at least a third of us were born overseas. So bring with us, or not me necessarily, but people born overseas bring with them lots of traditions and ethnic subcultures. And in our country, because there's lots of people coming together from different groups, they're able to sort of find people from similar ethnic subcultures. So we talked about that high and low context culture a moment ago. High context cultures, just a little bit more information, infer meanings from symbols and gestures more than words, where low context cultures place more emphasis on words in messages. And I encourage you just to spend a bit more time reading about that. Members of minority groups often find advertising spokespeople from their own group more trustworthy and credible. Now there's this thing called de-ethnicization, I think, I can't say it, which occurs when a product we associate with a specific ethnic group detaches itself from its roots and appeals to other groups. So think about Mexican cuisine, I think, is an interesting example. It's something that's become an Italian cuisine, something that's sort of become a bit more mainstream and not just of a specific ethnic group. Okay, let's move on to the next. Sorry, I keep moving myself out of the way. Okay, so ethnicity and acculturation. So this refers to the process of a movement or adaptation to a country's cultural environment by a person from another country. Sometimes there are agents that help people do this through people and institutions that teach the ways of a culture. And there's a process where people move to a different culture. They go through a period of translation and then a period of adaptation. But it can actually be really challenging. During this process, many immigrants might experience assimilation, maintenance, resistance, and segregation. And we, as if we're targeting different ethnic subgroups, or these people fall into our target market or are our target market, we need to really understand where people are and how those things might be impacting on their consumer decision making, particularly if we're engaging in marketing practice for groups, for social purposes, social marketing purposes, which is where we're trying to benefit an individual rather than make profit. This YouTube clip is really interesting because it sort of provides a bit of an example of culture shock, where people are coming into a new culture, which happens to be the US, and how their translation and adaptation to the new culture can be challenging. Some of the advice they're given, I think, like potato chips is a bit of a worry. Okay, I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just keep going. Another type of subculture that can be very influential is a religious subculture. For many, religion offers a path to supernatural happiness, and they adhere to a specific religion's culture and value system. So it's often a set of rules around behaviour as well. There are many different subcultures created by religion which relate to different consumer needs and values. Often it's interesting to understand religion because it can have quite significant impacts on behaviour. Religion influences our attitudes towards sexuality, birth rates, household formulation, food consumption, and political attitudes. And the impact of religion on consumption isn't that well studied in marketing. It's a bit taboo because we don't want to be seen to be, I guess, manipulating people in that way, I guess. And because it's very personal. And because there's been quite a bit of persecution around religion in the past. Religious affiliation has the potential to be a valuable predictor of consumer behaviour. Actually, some colleagues of mine and I have done some research. They started doing some research looking at pro-environmental behaviour and how it relates to religious affiliation, particularly within Christian affiliations. And we've been looking more at how, people in the household relate to energy efficiency and climate change based on their political and religious affiliation. So it's quite interesting. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. So the final thing we want to talk about today is age, and I want you to spend a bit of time about it. Now, age exerts a significant influence on one's identity. As we grow older, our needs and preferences change, and often in unison with those who are close to our own age. So there are different stages in our life which influences how we behave, but there's also different things that happen in our lifetime that influence people of a similar age in a similar way. Like there'll be a COVID generation, I imagine, of people who've sort of grown up experiencing this. This will be part of our generation. So we can think about things like a person's cognitive age, our chronological age, but also down aging, which refers to a trend for older people acting and feeling younger. And I think that probably has to do with advances in science where people are able to, continue living a much higher quality of life for longer. Now, age subcultures, and we talk about this in terms of generational theory, consists of people of similar ages who have undergone similar experiences. Now, this sales floor clip is quite interesting, and again, it talks about how different people from different generations behave differently. I'm just going to scoot down to the last slide. So, generational theory is based upon the assumption that consumers reflect similar values and social and economic experiences as other people in their age cohort. This is a list of the types of generations. So you've heard lots about Generation X, Y, and Z. And we've got Generation Alpha coming up, and there's always a new, generation coming through. And what characterises each of those groups sometimes goes into the name. So baby boom generation were born during post-war. Gen X were born between 1965 and 85.